Hello, I'm Dr. Bernadette Moorhead, and it is my great pleasure to be speaking with you today. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how we foster professional identity in social work students and practitioners. I'm going to do that by using my own institution, Charles Sturt University, as a case study. And I'm going to share with you how we draw on our national association to inform our curriculum and the kind of learning and teaching activities that we do with students and practitioners in order to encourage them to reflect upon and develop their professional identity. I'd like to first acknowledge Professor Otani for inviting me to this symposium and having the opportunity to present to you, as well as my dear colleagues, Professor Wendy Bowles and Associate Professor Karen Bell, who have worked with me closely on professional identity for many years now. So to share with you a little bit of information about me, I have been a lecturer. I'm now a senior lecturer at Charles Sturt University for 12 years. And I would say that my teaching and research areas overlap very, very closely. I teach in a lot of our core social work subjects. So our students will study a whole range of subjects, but there are some that are core social work subjects. We call them theory and practice subjects. And I spend a lot of my time teaching in those and developing students' professional identities in those subjects. I also work in our field education or placement subjects, and a lot of that translates into my research, where I did my PhD study on the professional identities of newly qualified social workers as well. So I'm very interested in early career social work, not just when social workers are in the student or their formative years, but also when they are out in the field. So I'll share a little bit more about me as I go along in this presentation. Here I want to just explain to you a little bit about my institution, Charles Sturt University, who I'll be speaking a little bit about today in terms of our program. So if you look over here to this image of Australia, our entire continent, there's two states here that are highlighted just on the bottom right. The bigger one is my state where I live, New South Wales, and the one below is Victoria, where you'll find Melbourne. So in the larger image here, you see this arrow pointing to a little dot called Sydney. So many of you are familiar with Sydney. I live over, it's about a 5-6 hour drive here in Wagga Wagga. So it's a bit of a drive. But that's where Charles Sturt University, one of our campuses, is. We also have campuses at these other smaller regional towns, so Bathurst, Orange, Dubbo, and Port Macquarie. The ones that have a star above them are where we have on-campus social work programs, where students study on campus and they study social work. Our students also study online. We have been running online social work or distance education since the 1990s. We're the largest provider of online or distance education in Australia. So we've always done a mix of on-campus and online, which has always been a joy. So our profile, our social work students, we have undergraduate program of social work as well as the postgraduate qualifying program. And for the postgraduate, the only option is to study online. Some of that, even though it's online, there are components that still need to be done on campus as well. Most of our students are female. They're mature-aged in their 30s and 40s. So they're actually already working often in the human services field, but they're trying to work towards getting a higher qualification and getting their social work degree. Most of them live along the coastline and are concentrated in Sydney, but they love studying with us because they can do it online and come to campus every now and then, as opposed to having to do a full-time course on campus. So going to then a little bit more about CSU and what we do. As you can see, we're spread out across many regional cities, but which is always added a lot of diversity and depth to our programs. We have in Australia one national body, that's the Australian Association of Social Work. In order to run our programs, we need to be accredited by the Australian Association, and they develop, in consultation with us and their members, the Australian Social Work Education and Accreditation Standards. We design our programs around those standards. They also have other standards that are for all practitioners, not just social work students or educators, called the practice standards. And we also draw heavily from those standards in designing our learning activities. So those two documents are very crucial for meeting our education goals. When our students study with us at CSU, we want them to learn these social work values, knowledge, and skills that are covered in these standards. And we want them to bridge, what they learn about social work with their own personal identities of who they are as a person, so that they can develop a professional identity and their own practice framework. And I'll come back to that notion in a moment. To realize those goals, we have all kinds of subjects that our students study, but in particular, for those 4 subjects that I mentioned back here in regards to my teaching, the theory and practice subjects. Our students do a total of 1,000 hours of field placement, usually do 2 500 hours each placements that they spread out during their studies, so that they can have a lot of opportunities to critically reflect with educators, practitioners, and other students. I mentioned on the previous slide, one of our goals is for our students to develop their own practice framework. This is a notion we draw from 2 Australian academics, Chenoweth and McAuliffe, and I'll provide the reference for you at the end. They talk about how every practitioner develops a framework that they use for decision-making in practice. When we want to decide, how do I respond? What do I do? It's because we have a framework that is guiding us. And that framework is made up of our values, of our skills, of our knowledge, and who we are as a person. So these elements of a practice framework relate really closely to what makes up a professional identity. And we spend a great deal of time getting our students to read, learn, write, be assessed on these elements throughout their studies. And I will give you some more examples about that in terms of those 4 subjects that I mentioned, the theory and practice subjects that are absolutely crucial for our students' development. So we have 4. They're presented here in a linear way. All students start in theory and practice 1. When it comes to 2, 3, and 4, they sometimes do that in different orders, but everyone must start in theory and practice 1, the foundations of practice. This is where we introduce students to social work values, ethics, basic knowledge, all the real foundational material, and we start them on the journey of thinking about who they are, what motivated them to become a social worker, to go on this journey, and to start relating that personal background to these foundations that they learn about. They then carry that on into the other theory and practice subjects. So in theory and practice 2, they spend a lot of time learning about how to work with individuals and families. They learn about counselling approaches and therapy, but micro-level practice in general, and how do they, bring who they are to create or develop a social work relationship. Then in theory and practice 4, we look specifically at how to work in groups, communities, and organizations. So they start expanding their practice framework even further about how to capture these layers. And the same with theory and practice 4, where they're looking at macro, how to do social action or big interventions, as well as early career planning, which is where we are getting them to consolidate their entire degree and really pull together their practice framework so that they can launch into qualified practice and keep reflecting on their practice framework in their early career. So I've spoken about how we do that in the curriculum, like develop professional identity by getting them to look at their practice framework in each of those layers. The way we do develop professional identity in field education, again, we're looking at their practice framework a lot. And there's things that they have to do before they go out on placement, during, as well as after at the end. So before our students even go out on placement, they have to complete theory and practice 1. So going back here is the foundations of practice. If a student does not complete that whole subject, they cannot proceed with any placement. They also have to do a preparation for placement subject that builds on what they studied in theory and prac 1. They do a lot of reflection and self-awareness and a self-assessment. And again, if they do not complete that, if they do not pass the assessment work, where they have to reflect on who they are as a person and what they're going to bring to placement, if they don't pass that, they don't proceed to placement. And if they do, wonderful, they get to go out on placement. When our students are on placement, they have to develop and execute what is called a learning plan. And I'm going to speak to that on the next slide. That's why I've got it in bold, but that really provides a structure to everything that they do and the activities and how they'll be assessed. They do a lot of supervision with social workers, as well as the university liaison. That's a role that I often do. So during a student's placement, I often come out onto the site, see the student, and catch up with them and see how things are going. Then when the student gets to the end of their placement, they have to do a summary where they talk about, again, how they have developed, what have they learned, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and that really helps them to articulate their professional identity. They also are often studying theory and practice 4 by the end of doing their placements. Or they could be studying their theory and practice subjects throughout this whole journey, but often our students are also finishing or will finish theory and practice 4 at the very end of their study and their placement. So I mentioned the learning plan. So just to give you a sense, going back for a moment to this slide, I pointed out this document, the practice standards. This is one area that we use the practice standards a lot. Our students, when they are given a blank document, the only side of the document that is filled in is on the left side here called, as you can see from this example, standard 4.4. So this comes from the practice standard document I just mentioned. It is standard 4.4, and it says a student articulates their practice framework that draws on contemporary theory, knowledge, methods, and values. So that's the standard they have to meet on placement. So this screenshot that I'm showing you is from a student who I was the university liaison for in 2021. So the student was to meet this standard. She identified some activities that she was going to do on her placement. Her placement was in a mental health setting where she was doing micro level practice, so working one-on-one with individuals and families. And she decided, in consultation with a supervisor, in order to meet that standard, she would create or map out her practice framework by listing the theories and the methods and the values that she was using whilst she was on placement. She also decided to compare that practice framework, so this was her own individualized framework, with the model of care that her agency has in their own documentation. So she decided to do that to help her to clarify what were the social work elements, what was her unique, her individualized professional identity that she was bringing to the agency, and how those two could fit well together so that she could work effectively. She documented that in her journal. And then in order to be assessed on that so that we knew she was meeting that standard in the first column, she discussed those findings with her supervisor and by presenting her journal. And she did all these activities and that outcome closer to the end of her placement. It wasn't the kind of thing she could have done early on. She needed to go and get practice and work with people and then go and reflect on her framework and compare and contrast. So that's an example of how we get our students to do that. And we also, when we do these kinds of activities with students, they carry it on into practice so that they can do it as a practitioner over their career. Now, finally, I want us to speak briefly then about our theory and practice for that last subject that our students are doing at the end of their studies. So we call this our capstone subject. When they in the first half of the subject, they learn about social action and macro practice. And then in the second half of the subject, we get them to do a macro look at their practice framework, their professional identity, and what they have studied across their entire degree, and how that all comes together to inform who they are at this point as they go out into qualified practice. And to help them do that or crystallize their understanding, their very last assessment item is a paper where they have to go and use these elements. So from Chenoweth and McAuliffe, they have to outline what their practice framework is at this point in time in the paper. They have to outline their values, their skills, their knowledge, and who they are. And we ask them to visually depict it as well. So some students will use this kind of image, but we also encourage our students to use metaphors, because Chenoweth and McAuliffe write about that in their chapter. It's an opportunity to be creative. Some students draw their practice framework like a tree. I've seen one of my favorites student papers that I marked, the student wrote about how her practice framework was a recipe and all the ingredients made up certain components of the recipe. Another student drew a car and how the components of the car made up his professional identity and practice framework. So you can see students can be very creative. So they outline their framework and provide a rationale for it. Then we get them to critique the main elements, like what are the main sort of weaknesses of that framework and how they could manage that. And the reason we do that is so that they are constantly being a critical thinker, that they're not just assuming that everything they do is great, that there are limitations and we need to account for those. So I hope that gives you a bit of a sense or a couple of examples of how we at CSU and here in Australia are trying to foster professional identity, and how, yes, I've spoken a lot about education and how students do it, but these are the foundations that we lay for our practitioners so that they will continue to draw from the practice standards and continue to develop and reflect upon who they are. These are some references you can follow up. I highly recommend, if you're interested in following the links to those education and those practice standards, if you're interested. And I've also written about with some colleagues how we have been transforming our curriculum over the recent years to really make sure we're putting professional identity at the forefront of all of our conversations with students. So I hope that this has been useful, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and if you ever want to contact me, my email is provided here. So thank you very much.